High above the Solomon Islands in August 1943, at 18,000 feet, Lieutenant Richard Bong stared in horror as his partner's P-38 Lightning twisted downward into the blue Pacific waters. 3 Japanese Zero fighters had surprised them from the clouds above. Now Bong faced them alone, with the main Zero moving right behind him. He tried the standard escape move, a sharp right turn with the engines at full power, hoping to climb higher than the enemy. But the Zero turned even sharper. The Japanese pilot was already lining up his shot, and Bong had maybe 4 seconds before deadly 20-meter bullets ripped his plane apart. What he did next wasn't taught in any flight school. Bong flipped his P-38 completely upside down and yanked the control stick forward. Rather than climbing away like the enemy expected, his plane dropped toward the ocean. Because he was flying inverted, he escaped in a direction the Zero pilot never saw coming. Blood pumped into his head. His eyesight turned red around the edges. For 2 terrible seconds, he could barely see his flight instruments. When he rolled back to normal flight at 12,000 feet, the Zero was way above him, flying past, totally out of position. Bong had made it through alive, and he had just discovered a flying technique that would change air battles across the entire Pacific War. This move broke every rule taught at pilot training school. Teachers at bases in California and Arizona specifically warned against flying with negative G-forces. They said it caused engine problems, plane damage, and pilot blackouts. The official rule was clear: don't do it. But in real combat, when a Zero pilot had you in his crosshairs, those warnings mattered less than staying alive. The pilots who survived their early fights with Zeros learned something tough. The normal air combat rules were getting Americans killed. Japanese pilots had perfected their skills through years of fighting over China. They knew every advantage their Mitsubishi A6M Zero possessed. American pilots were dying because they fought using peacetime training methods against an enemy who had already thrown out those old rules. The story of upside-down flying tactics shows more than standard war history. From 1942 to 1944, a small group of fighter pilots discovered that the human body could handle physical stress that doctors thought was impossible. They learned their planes could survive moves that engineers swore would break them apart. Most important, they proved that sometimes staying alive meant flying straight toward danger instead of running from it. This wasn't the clean version of Pacific air battles that showed up in official military reports. This was desperate, brutal problem-solving born from harsh reality, where instant decisions separated pilots who came home from those who became names on death lists. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero started fighting over China in 1940. By the time America joined the war in December 1941, Japanese pilots had thousands of combat hours practicing their tactics. The Zero's flying abilities created a deadly challenge for Allied pilots. At speeds under 300 mph, the Zero could outturn almost any fighter in the sky. Its turning circle at combat speeds was about 400 feet tighter than a P-38 Lightning and nearly 500 feet tighter than an F-4F Wildcat. In a traditional turning dogfight, the kind stressed in American training, the Zero pilot could simply circle inside his opponent's turn and get a clear shot within seconds, not early battle reports from the Philippines. And Java painted a dark picture. American pilots tried boom and zoom attacks, diving on Zeros from high altitude, shooting, then climbing away. But if the first attack didn't destroy the target, the Zero pilot would just enter a tight horizontal turn. When the American pilot tried to follow, he ended up on the outside of the circle, losing speed, becoming the target instead of the hunter. By mid-1942, in some areas, Japanese pilots were shooting down 3 American planes for every one they lost. Squadron commanders filed reports that basically admitted the same thing: we cannot win turning battles against this plane. The F-4F Wildcat, flown by Navy and Marine pilots, had better diving speed and could take more damage, but it turned slowly. The P-40 Warhawk flew well in up and down moves, but struggled at higher altitudes where many fights happened. The P-38 Lightning had 2 engines and powerful guns, but its wide turning circle made it vulnerable in horizontal combat. Each American fighter had strengths, firepower, armor, dive speed, but none could match the Zero's agility in normal dogfighting. Pilots were told to use their plane's strengths, avoid turning battles, keep their speed advantage. Smart advice, but combat rarely went according to plan. What made this crisis worse was how skilled Japanese naval pilots were in 1942 and early 1943. Many had been flying combat missions since the late 1930s. They understood energy control, accurate shooting while the target moved, and team tactics at an expert level. They knew exactly how to force American pilots into situations where the Zero's turning ability became overwhelming. A typical Japanese trick involved one Zero acting as bait, flying straight and level, looking easy to hit. When an American pilot committed to the attack, two more Zeros would drop from above or slide in from the sides. The American fighter suddenly had to defend itself, and defending meant entering a turning fight, which meant the Zero's advantages became crushing. The math of turning combat is brutal. Turn radius depends on speed and g-force. The Zero's lightweight design, achieved partly by removing armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, gave it superior turning performance. American fighters carried armor plate behind the pilot's seat, self-sealing tanks, and heavier weapons. These features kept pilots alive when hit, but they also added hundreds of pounds that increased wing loading and made turns wider. American pilots were basically asked to beat an opponent who owned the most important advantage in dogfighting, while flying planes built for survival rather than nimbleness. The move that would eventually save countless American lives didn't come from engineering textbooks or military doctrine. It came from raw desperation and accidental discovery. The split S, as it became known, involved rolling inverted and pulling through into a diving turn. In normal flight, pilots feel positive g-forces. Blood gets pushed toward their feet. Vision narrows, and around 5 to 6 Gs, many pilots experience gray out or blackout. But when a pilot rolls upside down and pulls the stick forward, he feels negative Gs. Blood rushes to the head. This effect is called red out because the visual field literally turns red as blood vessels in the eyes fill up. Aviation medicine in 1942 said humans could barely handle negative g-forces. Studies showed that even -2 Gs cause severe discomfort, confusion, and possible eye damage. Official guidance recommended avoiding negative G flight completely. But these studies happened in safe environments with test pilots who weren't being shot at. Combat created different math. A pilot experiencing 2 seconds of red vision but escaping a Zero's gun sight survived. A pilot who maintained perfect positive G flight but stayed in the Zero's crosshairs died. The choice wasn't comfortable versus uncomfortable. It was temporary blindness versus permanent death. The physics behind why the inverted dive worked involved energy management and surprising the opponent. When a Zero pilot got behind an American plane, he expected the target would either try to outturn him, impossible, or try to climb away, which slowed the American plane and made it an easier target. The inverted dive did neither. It converted altitude into speed in a direction the Zero pilot didn't expect. More importantly, if the Japanese pilot tried to follow through the move, his plane faced structural problems. The Zero was built to handle positive G loads up to about 7 Gs, but its lighter construction made negative G flight especially dangerous. Pulling negative Gs in a Zero risked the plane breaking apart, or engine problems because the aircraft's systems weren't designed for sustained inverted flight. The P-38's twin Allison engines had another advantage in negative G flight. Unlike single-engine fighters with carbureted engines, which could stop working during inverted moves, the P-38's engines used different fuel systems that worked more reliably under negative G loads. This wasn't a planned feature. Lockheed engineers weren't thinking about inverted combat tactics, but it became operationally important. A P-38 pilot could keep power through an inverted dive, while some chasing planes might lose power momentarily, widening the separation. The human body's ability to handle negative G-forces turned out to be higher than medical books suggested as long as the exposure was brief. Pilots reported that the red-out effect lasted only a few seconds during a properly done split S. Vision came back as the plane changed back to positive G flight during the pullout. The discomfort was intense, headaches, facial pressure, bloodshot eyes, but survivable. Several pilots noted in reports that they'd rather have a splitting headache back at base than a proper burial at sea. The unofficial risk calculation was simple. Negative G moves hurt. But Japanese cannons hurt worse. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron, flying P-38 Lightnings from Port Moresby, New Guinea, was the first pilot documented to use the inverted dive tactic on purpose rather than by instinct. On April 11, 1943, Lynch led a 4-plane patrol over the Huon Gulf when his group met 8 Zeros at 20,000 feet. Instead of fighting in a traditional horizontal battle, Lynch immediately rolled inverted when the lead Zero closed on him. He pulled through into a steep dive, sped up to over 400 mph, then rolled level at 8,000 feet. The Zero pilot trying to follow pulled out at 12,000 feet, either unwilling or unable to match Lynch's dive angle and speed. Lynch didn't just survive the encounter, he reversed the situation. After leveling out, he had both altitude separation and better speed. He used that energy advantage to climb back up, this time approaching the now scattered Japanese formation from below. The Zeros had lost their organization, chasing after what they thought were running American fighters. Lynch shot down 2 Zeros in the fight that followed. His wingman, copying his example through the inverted dive, survived without losses. The after-action report mentioned the tactic but didn't stress it. Official doctrine still discouraged negative G moves. What made Lynch's action important was intention. Other pilots had rolled inverted under pressure, survived, and chalked it up to luck. Lynch saw it as a repeatable technique. Within a week, he was teaching the move to other pilots in his squadron during informal briefings. The instruction was simple. If a Zero gets on your tail in a position where you can't shake him normally, roll inverted, pull through, dive hard, and use the speed to separate. Don't try to outturn him horizontally. Use the vertical dimension. The Zero owns the horizontal circle, but American fighters owned the vertical dive. By June 1943, the inverted dive tactic had spread to other P-38 units flying from Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. Pilots shared the technique during conversations in the ready room and between squadrons at briefings. The move stayed mostly unofficial, not banned but not officially approved in formal tactical documents either. Squadron leaders knew it worked but hesitated to put it in writing. The concern was partly about responsibility. If a pilot died attempting the move, questions would arise about who taught a tactic that went against established training. So it spread through word of mouth, experienced pilots showing newcomers how to do it without writing anything down. The 475th Fighter Group arrived in the Southwest Pacific in August 1943 and got informal lessons on the inverted dive tactic from veterans of the 49th Fighter Group, Major Charles McDonald, who would later become one of the Pacific Theater's greatest aces with 27 victories. Later said the split S move saved his life at least 3 times. His combat reports from late 1943 show a pattern. Engage Zeros from altitude, make a high-speed pass. If the enemy counterattacks during the climb back up, roll inverted and dive away. Reset the fight on better terms. It wasn't pretty dogfighting. It was practical survival math that happened to produce wins. The physical price of negative G flight was something no training manual truly prepared pilots for. During a typical split S move, pilots pulled -2 to -3 Gs. Blood pressure in the head increased dramatically. Pilots reported an immediate sensation of extreme pressure behind the eyes, followed by the red-out effect where their entire visual field turned crimson. The pressure came from blood vessels in the retina and conjunctiva, filling with blood, pushed upward by the negative acceleration. For 2 to 3 seconds, a pilot was essentially flying blind, relying on feel and memory of where the instruments were to keep the plane under control. Flight surgeon Captain James Moorhead, stationed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in late 1943, documented the physical aftermath of these moves. He examined dozens of pilots who regularly used inverted dive tactics. Nearly all showed petechial hemorrhaging, tiny broken blood vessels creating red spots across their faces, particularly around the eyes and forehead. Some experienced subconjunctival hemorrhages that left their eyes blood red for days. Severe headaches were universal. A few pilots reported temporary vision problems, blurred sight, or trouble focusing that lasted several hours after landing. Moorhead's informal conclusion, never published in medical journals, was that the moves caused measurable physical damage, but nothing permanently crippling. The greater danger was the moment of blindness itself. During those few seconds of red-out, a pilot couldn't see his altitude gauge, airspeed indicator, or attitude instruments. He certainly couldn't see the enemy plane or the ground getting closer. The move required total commitment. A pilot had to establish the dive angle, pull the negative Gs, then hold that control input until his sight came back, trusting that he calculated his altitude correctly before rolling inverted. Several fatal accidents in training happened when pilots started the move too low or held the dive too long. There was no margin for error at 5,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, a pilot had time to fix mistakes. The mathematical calculation became part of survival. Never go inverted below 8,000 feet unless death was otherwise certain. Experienced pilots developed ways to reduce the red-out duration. Some learned to tense their neck and face muscles, trying to limit blood flow to the head. Others discovered that if they rolled inverted but pulled less hard on the stick, trading maximum maneuver performance for slightly better vision, they could keep partial sight throughout the move. This became a tough choice. Maximum negative G input created the fastest separation from a chasing zero, but caused complete visual blackout. Moderate negative G input let the pilot keep some visual reference, but reduced how well the escape worked. In practice, most pilots chose maximum separation. Better to be blind for 3 seconds and alive than partially aware and shot down. The mental part was equally tough. Human beings have strong instincts against actions that cause pain and loss of senses. Voluntarily causing temporary blindness while someone is trying to kill you goes against every survival instinct. Yet pilots learn to override that instinct. The first time was terrifying. The second time was still scary. By the 5th or 6th time, it became just another unpleasant part of combat flying, like anti-aircraft fire, like managing fuel, like watching friends die. The body adapted, the mind adapted. What seemed impossible in a training environment became normal when the alternative was a 20mm cannon shell through the cockpit. The inverted dive tactic moved through the Pacific theater like an unofficial transmission, spreading from squadron to squadron without ever appearing in official tactical publications. By September 1943, P-38 units across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands regularly taught the move to replacement pilots during their first week in country. The instruction happened casually. Veteran pilots took new arrivals aside after evening meal, describing what worked and what got people killed. Squadron commanders knew it was happening. Some actively encouraged it, others pretended not to notice, maintaining plausible deniability in case 5th Air Force Headquarters asked uncomfortable questions about unauthorized training. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th Fighter Group flying P-47 Thunderbolts from Port Moresby, incorporated the split S into his unit's tactical doctrine in October 1943. The P-47 was even heavier than the P-38, making it outmatched in turning combat against Zeros, but the Thunderbolt could dive faster than almost anything in the sky, and its radial engine handled negative G flight reasonably well. Kirby's approach was straightforward. He told his pilots explicitly that if they tried to turn with a zero, they'd die. If they used the P-47's weight and power to dictate vertical fights, diving attacks followed by inverted escapes when necessary, they'd survive and win. Kirby personally shot down 6 Japanese aircraft on October 11, 1943 using these tactics. He received the Medal of Honor for that mission. Marine Corps F-4U. Corsair squadrons adopted similar techniques in early 1944. The Corsair had performance advantages over the Zero in most ways except turning circle. Marine pilots flying from island bases like Munda and Vella La Vella found that the inverted dive worked even better in the Corsair than in twin-engine fighters. The F-4U's powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine kept thrust through negative G moves, and the aircraft's structural strength meant pilots could pull out of dives at higher speeds without fearing wing damage. Major Robert Gaylor, teaching tactics to VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron demonstrated the move repeatedly, emphasizing that it was a defensive escape tactic, not an offensive weapon. By mid-1944, the technique had reached Navy carrier squadrons operating in the Central Pacific. Fighter pilots flying from carriers like USS Essex and USS Lexington got briefings that now included inverted moves as accepted tactics. The official terminology varied. Some called it a split S. Others called it a negative G break. Some simply called it rolling downward. The language didn't matter. The execution was consistent. When conventional defensive moves failed, invert and dive, with the safety threshold remaining around 8,000 feet. Below that altitude, pilots were instructed to use other escape options or accept that they were in a fight to the death. Not all aircraft types could safely do the move. Navy F-6F Hellcat pilots reported that their carbureted engines sometimes coughed or quit during sustained inverted flight, though they usually restarted quickly. Army Air Force P-40 pilots found their aircraft structurally sound for the move, but lacking the dive performance to create enough separation from chasing Zeros. These limitations meant that tactics remained aircraft-specific. A P-38 pilot could rely on the inverted dive as a primary defensive tool. A P-40 pilot needed different escape options. The underlying principle, however, had become universal across the theater. Vertical moves, including inverted flight when necessary, beat horizontal turning fights every time. Japanese pilots eventually recognized the American inverted dive tactic and tried to develop counter-moves. By late 1943, combat reports from returning Zero pilots mentioned American fighters rolling inverted and diving away at high speed. Initial Japanese assessments saw this as purely defensive, evidence that American pilots feared close combat and were running rather than fighting. This interpretation was strategically dangerous for Japanese airmen because it reinforced their existing tactical doctrine while missing the actual threat. The inverted dive wasn't retreat. It was a reset that let American pilots choose when and how to re-engage on favorable terms. Some Japanese pilots tried following American fighters through inverted dives. The results were often fatal. The Zero's lightweight construction, which gave it superior turning performance, became a problem in high-speed vertical moves. The aircraft's frame was stressed to positive G limits, but had reduced safety margins in negative G flight. Several Zero pilots who attempted to follow P-38s through aggressive inverted dives experienced control surface flutter or structural failure. Others found that their Nakajima Sakai engines experienced fuel delivery problems during inverted flight, causing power loss at the worst possible moment, mid-dive, while trying to keep an enemy aircraft in sight. A documented incident from December 1944 over Lady Gulf showed the tactic's lethality when Zero pilots attempted to counter it. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McGuire, flying a P-38, was engaged by 4 Zeros at 18,000 feet. When the lead Zero got a firing position, McGuire rolled inverted and dove. The Japanese pilot followed, trying to keep McGuire in his gun sight. Two things happened at the same time. McGuire's P-38 accelerated past 450 Outsmarted in the dive while staying structurally intact, and the chasing Zero began experiencing severe shaking around 380 mph. The Japanese pilot was forced to pull out early or risk the plane breaking apart. McGuire leveled at 6,000 feet, climbed back into the fight with better energy, and shot down 2 of the 4 Zeros. The other 2 disengaged. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was that their best aircraft, the Zero, was built for the wrong kind of combat by late 1944. Early in the war, when fights happened at medium altitudes and involved prolonged turning battles, the Zero's characteristics were perfect. But as American tactics shifted toward high-speed slashing attacks and vertical moves, the Zero's advantages became meaningless, while its disadvantages, lack of armor, lightweight structure, lower dive speed, became critical weaknesses. Japanese aircraft designers recognized this problem. Later, Zero variants and newer designs like the J-2M Raiden had improved dive performance and stronger structures. But these planes arrived in limited numbers and too late to change the tactical balance. Japanese training programs couldn't adapt quickly enough either. By 1944, Japan was losing experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced. New pilots received shortened training that emphasized basic flying and traditional dogfighting tactics. There wasn't time or fuel to teach advanced energy management or vertical combat techniques. Meanwhile, American training programs had absorbed lessons from combat veterans. Replacement pilots arriving in the Pacific in late 1944 already knew about inverted dive tactics before they flew their first combat mission. The knowledge advantage had flipped. Japanese pilots, once the most experienced in the theater, were now often the least prepared for the war's actual tactical environment. The inverted dive, tactics developed over the Pacific between 1943 and 1945, didn't vanish when World War II ended. They became woven into fighter tactics doctrine, though often without credit to the desperate problem-solving of P-38 and Corsair pilots fighting for survival. Modern fighter combat training at places like the Navy Fighter Weapons School, known as Top Gun, includes negative G moves as standard defensive tactics. The terminology has changed. Contemporary pilots call it a negative G pushover or unloaded roll, but the fundamental physics and purpose remain, identical to what Thomas Lynch figured out over new. Guinea in April 1943, the Korean War saw American pilots using similar tactics against MiG-15s. The Soviet-built jet fighter had excellent performance at high altitude and could outturn most American aircraft in horizontal combat. F-86 Sabre pilots, facing comparable problems to what P-38 pilots encountered against Zeros, used vertical moves and negative G escapes when MiGs achieved advantageous positions. Captain Joseph McConnell, the top American ace of the Korean War with 16 victories, credited his survival in several battles to what he called rolling out underneath pursuing MiGs, exactly the same inverted dive concept, now applied to jet combat at 40,000 feet, and 600mm Vietnam-era fighter pilots rediscovered these lessons the hard way. Early in that conflict, American pilots trained mainly for beyond visual range. Missile combat found themselves in close-range dogfights against nimble MiGs and MiG-21s. The initial engagement results were poor. The establishment of Top Gun in 1969 at Naval Air Station Miramar represented institutional acknowledgement that dogfighting skills, including negative G defensive moves, remained critically important despite technological advances. Instructors at Top Gun taught tactics that Pacific War veterans would have recognized immediately. Use your aircraft's strengths, avoid the enemy's advantages, and when defending, go vertical and inverted if necessary. Modern fighter aircraft are designed with negative G capability built in from the start. The F-16, F-A-18, and F-35 all have fuel systems, engine designs, and structural strength that allow sustained negative G flight without the limitations that plagued World War II aircraft. Pilots train in centrifuges to build tolerance for both positive and negative G forces. The red-out effect that terrified pilots in 1943 is now a known and manageable phenomenon. But the underlying principle hasn't changed. Negative G flight allows moves that opponents don't anticipate, creating separation and opportunities for counterattack. What makes the Pacific War innovation remarkable is that it happened entirely outside official channels. No aeronautical engineer designed the tactic, no tactical development board approved it, no training command incorporated it into syllabi until after pilots had already proven its effectiveness through hundreds of combat engagements. It spread through the warrior network, experienced pilots teaching survival skills to new arrivals, person to person, squadron to squadron. The men who developed these tactics didn't receive recognition beyond their immediate units. Most never knew their improvised solutions would influence fighter combat doctrine for the next 80 years. Richard Bong, America's top ace with 40 victories, survived the war partly because he mastered vertical combat and wasn't afraid to fly inverted when circumstances demanded. Thomas Lynch, who first employed the tactic intentionally, was killed in action over the Philippines in March 1944. Not because his tactics failed, but because combat flying was statistically lethal, regardless of skill. Their legacy isn't in medals or official recognition. It's in the fact that fighter pilots today still train to roll inverted and push negative G when defensive. A direct lineage exists to desperate innovations made in cockpits over the Pacific, where survival required rewriting the rules mid-flight.